My wife arrived with me at the company couple's dinner, but left with another man, and that was perhaps the most quietly violent moment I've ever experienced. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself, the public abandonment, the social humiliation in front of colleagues and friends. It was the exact moment my eyes met hers and I realized she'd already been gone long before that gesture. Her body was still beside me, but her soul had long since moved on. And in that final look, as she walked away with a strange smile of relief and freedom, I understood, that wasn't an impulse, it wasn't an accident, it wasn't a stumble. It was a choice. Cold. Conscious. Repeated. I didn't make a scene. I didn't shout. I didn't chase her. I just finished my wine slowly, as if silence could intoxicate me more than alcohol. I got home before her. I set a quiet atmosphere, almost like a normal dinner. Low lights. No rehearsed words. When she came in, I took off my shoes as usual, but it was when she tried to kiss me on the cheek as if a wordless apology that I backed away. There was no anger. There was only truth. I said, "You changed more than just company. You changed your life," and then I signed with my eyes the sentence she never expected, the end. I walked out the door with a peace as strange as it was new, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't look back. The days that followed were silent, but not empty. It was as if each absence of her within me made room for something new. The pain was there, evident, but there was a layer of lucidity I had never felt before. I discovered that when love breaks, it doesn't shatter, it becomes silent. A silence so dense you can hear your own conscience scream. And it was in this space that I began to see everything that had previously been shadow, the absences disguised as routine, the lost glances during dinner, the automatic kisses, the silences that stretched on for no reason, the flimsy excuses I pretended not to notice. The betrayal, in fact, wasn't at that dinner. The betrayal had been happening in small, invisible doses for a long time. This was just the final toast. She tried to return days later. Perhaps she hoped to still find that available, submissive man, always willing to fix what she broke. But she didn't realize that the greatest betrayal wasn't leaving, it was making me lose myself in an attempt to hold on to her. And I wasn't there anymore. Another version of me had been born. A version that no longer begged to be chosen. A version that understood that love doesn't survive where respect is lacking. And that those who leave us once have always been ready to leave us. She sat in front of me with red eyes and trembling hands. She begged for forgiveness. He said it was a mistake. An impulse. That he didn't know what he felt. But what hurt me wasn't the betrayal itself. It was realizing that our love was disposable to her. That she'd bet everything on a fleeting desire, a temporary whim, and when she discovered it wasn't love, she wanted to return to the comfort of the stability I'd once offered. She told me, I realized it too late. He doesn't see me. He uses me. And yet, I still think about you. That I stared at her for a few seconds. I remembered all the Sundays I cooked for her. All the times I accepted cold silence in place of an honest conversation. I remembered our wedding anniversary, where she forgot the date and said she was busy with an urgent commitment. I remembered my loneliness beside her. And then I replied with a slight smile, I forgive. But forgiveness isn't a bridge. It's a door. One I close carefully, without anger, just so each person can move forward in the direction they've chosen, she cried. But it was a different kind of crying. It wasn't pure regret. It was the pain of someone who realized that the chance she threw away was, in fact, the only real one. After that, the seasons changed within me. I began to look at myself in the mirror with less guilt and more clarity. And when I least expected it, I found someone. Someone who didn't arrive to fix what was broken, but to show me there was still room for a new beginning. She had a calm gaze, a presence that didn't demand attention, but commanded respect. And it was with her that I relearned that love is a daily choice, not an emotional obligation. I discovered how good it feels to be seen. To be heard. To be a priority without having to beg for it. For the first time, I didn't feel indebted to anyone. I felt whole. And in this new love, there were no ghosts from the past trying to steal space, there was only truth. The ex-wife, in turn, tried to start over. But the man she'd left me for never truly chose her. He enjoyed the freedom she represented. But he wasn't willing to build anything. And when she realized she'd been just a detour on someone's path, not the final destination, she wanted to return. But time had already taken its toll on me. She reappeared once more, with words that now carried genuine pain. There was no more arrogance. There was naked, unvarnished regret. And it was by listening to it all in silence, without interrupting, that I realized how much she'd lost. Because now, she was talking about love. But I had already found mine elsewhere. The last time we saw each other, she asked me if I still thought about her. And I said yes. But not as someone who yearns. As someone who forgives. And then, she smiled with teary eyes and said, "You were always better than I could see." That I just nodded. Because there, in that moment, I no longer felt hurt. I felt pity. Pity for someone who only understood the value of something after destroying it. And no matter how sincere the forgiveness, the love, that had already turned into a good kind of longing. The kind that doesn't hurt. It just reminds me. But there was something she told me that night that I'll never forget. Something that, once again, changed the course of everything. Something that can only be revealed at the right time. Because sometimes, the true impact of betrayal isn't the pain it causes, but the truth it reveals when it's too late. And that truth, is yet to come. Welcome to the channel. Here, no form of betrayal is romanticized or condoned, on the contrary, our fictional stories reveal how infidelity destroys homes, hearts, and destinies. Each narrative carries a single truth: those who cheat may choose when to leave, but never what they lose by doing so. Get ready, because what you're about to hear is more than a story, it's a reality check. Enjoy listening. His name was Daniel, and he was the kind of man who learned early on the value of small things, the way the sun shines through the windows in the morning, the taste of a leisurely brewed coffee, the comfortable silence of a Sunday afternoon. He grew up in a simple but caring home, where his parents loved each other with that constancy that makes no noise but sustains everything. Daniel carried this in his way of life, attentive, present, always willing to listen more than talk. He was a man of effective routines, not because he was afraid of new things, but because he believed that love was repeating with intention, every day, the gesture of choosing someone. He worked in marketing, but never allowed himself to be a product of appearance. He was direct, kind, committed. The kind who carries the bags, observes the details, remembers the dates. He had a precise, effective memory, almost emotionally dangerous, because he gave himself completely to even the seemingly small. She was Isabella. Charismatic, enigmatic, a presence that made itself felt even before any words were spoken. She had that sparkle in her eyes of someone who always wanted more from life, not empty ambition, but intense. She enjoyed long conversations, sudden trips, breathtaking experiences. She had a free laugh, but also an introspective side, as if she carried within her a past that couldn't be fully deciphered. An only child of emotionally absent parents, she learned to fend for herself from an early age. And this was reflected in the way she protected herself. She charmed easily, but allowed few to truly touch her. Isabella was intense, but selective, passionate, but discerning. Upon meeting Daniel, she found herself surprised. It wasn't an explosive enchantment. It was a rare feeling of warmth, as if the world, for the first time, didn't demand she be more than she already was. He didn't admire her for an ideal. He saw what was there, without fantasies. And that disarmed her. The two met by chance, at a get-together between mutual friends, one random weekend. Daniel wasn't the type to dominate a room, but Isabella sensed his presence even before they were introduced. He laughed with his eyes. And she, who had always been wary of those who smiled easily, found herself curious about this man with his calm speech and fixed gaze. The conversation began unpretentiously and stretched on for hours. It was as if time took on a different rhythm when they spoke to each other. She talked about the places she wanted to see, he talked about the routes he'd built. She questioned the world, he believed in people. They were opposites in essence, but there was an invisible bridge between them that made anything seem possible. It wasn't love at first sight. It was a slow, deep dive, the kind where you only realize the depth when you can no longer see the surface. Their relationship began a few months later and, like everything else about them, was built on dialogue. Neither of them was in a rush, but neither were afraid of intensity. Families met, friendships began to intertwine. They lived in different neighborhoods, but not a day went by without them seeing each other, even if only for 15 minutes. Isabella, who had always valued her freedom, felt secure enough to carve out spaces in her life. And Daniel, who had always had fixed habits, learned to live with the slight unpredictability she brought. There were arguments, yes, but always followed by conversation. No argument silenced them. They learned to disagree without distancing themselves, to apologize without canceling each other out. Daniel loved her with the constancy of someone watering a plant every day. Isabella loved him with the urgency of someone who has found a harbor after a storm. The wedding came after 3 years of dating. It was a small ceremony, for only the closest, but charged with emotion. Daniel wrote his own vows, and in each word there was a silent promise of presence. Isabella, for the first time, cried reading hers. She said she never imagined she would find someone who made her believe in permanence. Their honeymoon was simple but memorable, a place surrounded by nature, where their connection seemed even more intense. Upon returning home, they moved into a newly purchased apartment, decorated with a blend of their mutual tastes. She took care of the colors, the paintings, the details. He took care of the repairs, the organization, the functionality. It was a home. And more than that, it was a life being carefully built. Over time, the days began to form a kind of subtle choreography. Daniel would wake up early, make coffee while Isabella got ready. She often worked outside the home, but also had days working from home. On weekends, they would go on simple outings, markets, coffee shops, movie nights at home with popcorn. They had plans. Many. An international trip together, maybe a baby before deciding on children. They were, to outsiders, the ideal couple. But what no one knew, not even them, in the beginning, is that love, however strong, requires constant maintenance. Because time doesn't destroy love by force. It just erodes at the edges when you don't take care of yourself. Daniel began to get more and more involved in his work, seeking recognition, stability, and growth. Not out of vanity, but because he wanted to offer security. Isabella, on the other hand, began to feel stagnant. Her ideas no longer resonated, her desires began to clash with silence. Their conversations continued, but the frequency with which they looked each other in the eye decreased. And it was almost imperceptible. Because there was still affection, there was still respect. But intimacy began to give way to functionality. The kiss before bed became a habit. Touch became routine. Passion became comfort. And while comfort is good, for some hearts, it can also be a prison. Still, they persisted. Because there was history. There was a past. There were good memories. And, most of all, there was the idea that they were right for each other. And sometimes, the idea of something is what holds us most. Isabella began to search outside for what she felt was missing inside. I'm not talking about people. I'm talking about experiences. New courses, different friends, new perspectives. Daniel, focused on providing stability, didn't notice the small separations. For him, everything was fine. Because she still smiled, still said, "I love you," still slept beside him. But what he didn't know was that her "I love you" no longer came from the same place. There was a period when she started going out more, extending commitments, bringing new stories. And Daniel, always understanding, thought it was good that she was happy. He thought it was a reflection of his support. And it was. But it was also the beginning of something he couldn't see. When he tried to suggest trips or time together, she was always busy. When she wanted to talk, she said she was tired. But he believed her. Because love is also about trust. And he trusted. Blindly. Time passed. The seasons changed. Life continued. But something had already shifted. Isabella no longer smiled with the same eyes. Daniel no longer looked at her with the same intensity. But everything was so subtle that it seemed just a phase. As if, at some point, everything would fall back into place. But not everything that moves returns. Some distances, when not noticed in time, become abysses. Still, there was one night when everything seemed the same. A special dinner at home. Laughter, wine, good conversation. It was a night of respite. And perhaps that's exactly what it was, a silent farewell to what was already falling apart. Because love, sometimes, has the delicacy to say goodbye beautifully. As if it didn't want to be remembered with pain. What came after that night would change everything. But for now, everything seemed just normal. The weeks began to unfold with a strange rhythm, almost as if time were passing too quickly for some things and too slowly for others. Daniel woke up every day at the same time, made coffee with the same care, set her cup on the table with the same delicacy, but there was something about her small gestures that no longer fit. Isabella no longer appeared in the kitchen with her hair tied up haphazardly and a sleepy smile. Often, she wouldn't even come downstairs before he left. She began to justify her absences with projects, meetings, get-togethers with friends he didn't always know. He wasn't suspicious by nature, and this had always been one of the traits that most reassured her over the years. He was never intrusive, didn't check his phone, didn't ask insinuating questions. But even without proof, the body begins to sense when something is wrong. And Daniel's body began to react before his mind could even accept it. Isabella started dressing differently. New perfumes, clothes she hadn't worn in ages, makeup applied even for casual encounters. And instead of feeling awed by having a woman who drew attention to herself by his side, he began to feel like he was no longer the focus of that light. He tried to talk, to bring up topics that had previously interested her, but she seemed increasingly spaced out, responding distractedly, as if her mind was always elsewhere. And she was. He just didn't know where. Or with whom. One night, Daniel came home early. He'd left work after a cancelled meeting, and when he opened the door, he expected to find her watching a show or preparing something light for dinner. But the house was silent, and the smell in the air was different. It was a strong perfume, one he didn't recognize. In the bathroom, there were subtle traces of freshly removed makeup, the towel still damp, and a lipstick on the sink he'd never seen before. When she arrived minutes later, breathless, saying she'd just gone for a walk to clear her head, he watched her like someone trying to piece together a puzzle whose edges no longer make sense. He said nothing. He just watched. And in silence, he began to withdraw a little too. Not physically, but emotionally. He began to pay more attention to his surroundings, to the details, to the broken patterns he hadn't allowed himself to see before. The company's couples' dinner was approaching. It was an important, traditional event, and Daniel made a point of inviting her weeks in advance. She accepted immediately, with a smile he could no longer read. They bought new clothes for the occasion, discussed the menu, and he even commented that it would be good for both of them to break out of their routine. And she agreed, with the naturalness of someone feigning enthusiasm to maintain an appearance that no longer reflects their true nature. On the way to the event, Isabella seemed distracted. She frequently checked her phone, typing quickly, then deleting, then typing again. Daniel, behind the wheel, noticed everything out of the corner of his eye, but still tried to keep the mood light. He talked about his colleagues, commented on the latest campaigns, tried to evoke old memories, the ones that used to make her laugh. But nothing made an impact. As if everything he said was coming from a place too far away to reach her. Upon arrival, they were greeted cordially. Smiles, greetings, a few admiring glances at the couple, still seen as a role model by many. Daniel moved around elegantly, chatted naturally, but from time to time he glanced at Isabella. And she was no longer where he expected. He saw her laughing with a group he barely knew, then whispering in his ear to a man he'd never seen before. There was a sudden intimacy between them, calculatedly spontaneous gestures, subtle touches on the arm, glances that didn't easily stray. Daniel felt a bitter taste in his throat. For the first time, his body felt chilled even amid the heat of the crowded room. He took a deep breath, tried to rationalize. Maybe it was just paranoia. Maybe he was reading too much into things. But the truth is, intuition, when it screams, is rarely wrong. The night went on, but something inside him had already changed. When she returned to the table, smiling as if nothing had happened, he held her gaze for a few seconds. There was a distance there that wasn't physical, but emotional. And she noticed. She tried to compensate with kisses on his cheek, intertwined hands, but he knew that touch wasn't the same. Daniel, always discreet, didn't want a confrontation there. It wasn't the time. It wasn't the place. But something inside him had awakened, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the truth would fully emerge. In the following days, the silence between them became deafening. Isabella maintained her routine, but her schedule became increasingly unpredictable. Sometimes she left early, sometimes she returned late, sometimes she said she was too exhausted to talk. Daniel, for his part, began to live in observation. Every gesture, every word, every message was filtered by the feeling that everything was a lie. And yet, he didn't confront her. Not yet. It was as if he wanted to give her a chance to be honest. But that chance never came. Until one random night, her phone rang while she was in the shower. It was a man's name, followed by an emoji. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just watched. When she returned, he simply said he needed to talk. They sat in the living room, the silence dragging on for long seconds. And then he asked, "How long has it been since you've been here?" She tried to deny it, deflect it, say he was imagining things. But he didn't ask if something was wrong. He asked how long. Because the doubt was gone. The confirmation was in the gestures, the looks, the absences. Isabella sighed, lowered her eyes, and finally confessed. There was someone. It wasn't love, it was just something she couldn't explain. An impulse. An escape. A refuge from routine. She said she didn't know how things got to this point, that she still loved him, that she didn't want to lose him. But Daniel could no longer listen with his heart. Only with his mind. And reason told him that, once trust is broken, love can't be sustained solely by the past. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just stood up. He said he needed to think. And he left the house. He walked the streets as if gasping for air. Each step was an attempt to understand where he had gone astray. How someone who had dedicated everything could be cast aside for so little. The pain wasn't just the betrayal, but the realization that she had lied for so long while he continued to believe her. It was as if he had loved alone for months. The next morning, he didn't come home. He spent the night at a friend's house. He needed distance, clarity, and solitude. Isabella texted. She called. She said she wanted to talk. But he didn't respond. He still couldn't. Because the love he still had was being eroded by disappointment. And for Daniel, worse than being betrayed was knowing that the love he believed was reciprocated was nothing more than an illusion. The next night, she showed up at the company dinner. She wore a new dress, a practiced smile, and walked as if nothing had happened. Beside him. As if they were still the couple everyone admired. But he, already broken inside, simply followed her in silence. And it was there, at that very event where it all began, that the cycle came full circle. Because at the end of the night, she didn't return with him. And she left with the same man who had stolen her attention weeks before. He watched it all without moving. As if the world had stopped for a second so he could accept that it was over. He returned home alone. He sat on the edge of his bed. And for the first time in a long time, he cried. Not for the loss of Isabella, but for the loss of himself within that relationship. Hours later, she returned. But he was no longer the same man. And the decision he made that night would forever mark their paths. Because, although he didn't know it yet, what Isabella carried with her, was a secret that would change everything. Isabella returned home the next morning as if the world still belonged to her. She kicked off her heels at the door, tossed her bag on the sofa, and, noticing the lamplight on in the hallway, hesitated for a moment. She knew he would be awake. And yet, she didn't seem ready to face the silence that awaited her at the end of the hall. She walked slowly, feeling the cold floor under her feet, trying to find some explanation in her mind that seemed less shameful than reality. When she pushed open the bedroom door, she found him sitting in the corner armchair, with the posture of someone who no longer expected anything, simply there out of self-respect. His eyes no longer sought justification, nor accusation. It was as if she had died inside him, and all that remained now was the formality of burying it with dignity. When she tried to speak, he interrupted her with a calm gesture, slowly standing up. He said he didn't want to fight, didn't want to yell, he just wanted to be fair to himself. And that was when he announced the divorce. Without rancor, without tears, without drama. Just one sentence, spoken firmly, with the weariness of someone who loved until the end and was still left behind. She lost her balance, stammering that she still loved him, that she had made a mistake, that she didn't know what she was doing. But he simply replied, his eyes fixed on hers, that love is a choice, and that she had already chosen another direction. Before leaving, he said, "You changed more than just company. You changed your life," and then she turned and left. And the sound of that door closing echoed inside her like the end of everything she knew as home. In the days that followed, Isabella experienced what it was like to live in an echo chamber. The messages that once filled her phone disappeared, her commitments seemed to lose their luster, and the man she had been involved with, until then charming and present, began to seem increasingly distant. He didn't want to talk about feelings, didn't care about her insecurities, and showed no intention of building something real. Isabella, who until then believed she was in control of her own life, realized he was nothing more than a convenient distraction for someone who had never wanted more than to spend time alone. When she tried to talk about the future, she heard cold and disinterested phrases. When she tried to relive some memory of the euphoric days, she realized he couldn't even remember details that had been meaningful to her. It was as if she had woken from a dream and discovered she was completely alone in the room. One particularly quiet night, she found him in a restaurant, sitting with another woman. He laughed in a way she recognized, a way she believed was unique to her. When she confronted him, she was told, unceremoniously, that there was no commitment between them, that he'd never promised anything, and that if she'd interpreted too much, that was her problem. The words hurt not just because of their coldness, but because, deep down, she knew. She knew he'd never chosen her. That she'd thrown herself into the void, hoping to find ground. And now, she was at the bottom. Without Daniel, without affection, without a home, without even a shoulder to lean on for the pain growing inside her chest. She returned home feeling the weight of reality sinking into her shoulders. For the first time, she truly cried. Not out of remorse for the betrayal, but because she understood what she'd lost. And because she realized she'd never get it back. Days later, she summoned the courage to go to Daniel's new address. She didn't know if he would agree to see her, but she had to try. He opened the door with the serenity of someone already in a different emotional place. His gaze no longer held any pain. It held a lesson. Isabella tried to compose herself, but her voice wavered. You said you were sorry. That what you did to each other didn't erase what you shared. That, despite the mistake, there was still love. Daniel listened respectfully. He didn't interrupt her. When she finished, he responded with a calmness that dashed any hope. I forgive you. Not because I want you back, but because I need to move on. Forgiveness is my final point. It's not a comma for a new beginning. You were important. But now, it's the past, she cried, perhaps hoping his suffering would keep her connected. But he didn't. There was too much peace in his gaze. A peace that only exists in those who have accepted that some people hurt us because they don't know how to love beyond their own navel. Isabella left carrying the weight of an unresolved story, not with him, but with herself. And it was on her way home, on a quiet night, that something happened. Stopping at a gas station to fill up, she saw a familiar figure from afar. A woman sitting alone at a nearby diner, reading a book she herself had dismissed years before, saying it was too boring for her taste. It was Clara. A former co-worker of Daniel's, whom Isabella had always considered dull, and too conservative. Clara was the kind of woman Isabella never considered a threat. Simple, discreet, soft-spoken. The opposite of her. But there, at that table, Clara smiled with a serene glow, and she wasn't alone. Daniel arrived minutes later, lightly touched her shoulder, and kissed her tenderly. A calm, long, sincere kiss. They laughed about something, and he placed his hand over hers naturally, as if he'd done it 1,000 times before. Isabella froze. The world seemed to lose its sound. That was the woman Daniel was with now. And in that moment, everything fell into place. Because it was Clara who always listened to him during coffee breaks. Clara who helped him with his reports. Clara who was involved in the details Isabella ignored. Clara, the woman she'd never seen. But who she now clearly saw occupying the place that had once been hers. Karma, in that moment, was realizing that the love she'd thrown away was now treated with reverence by another woman. And that Daniel, beside Clara, smiled with the same brightness as when he'd first met her, but with one difference, now it was returned. The pain Isabella felt wasn't just jealousy. It was shame. The knowledge that she'd lost something real for a whim that didn't even last. She tried to justify it mentally, to find some flaw in Clara, some trait that invalidated the relationship. But there was none. Because what destroyed her most was seeing that Daniel didn't need revenge, scandal, or provocation. He simply moved on. And moved on well. She, on the other hand, continued to carry regrets. The next day, Isabella went to Daniel's parents' house to return some boxes of forgotten belongings. She was greeted politely, but with a coldness she wasn't used to experiencing there. While his mother checked the items, his father watched her silently. After a few minutes, he walked her to the gate. And before she got into the car, he said firmly, "You were a part of my son's life. And we respect that. But whoever destroys the love of someone who only knows how to love, loses much more than a relationship. They lose the right to be remembered fondly," and then he closed the gate without waiting for an answer. Isabella returned home feeling as if nothing remained of who she had been with Daniel. It was as if all the places that had once called her name were now silent. She picked up her phone, opened her photo gallery, and saw records that no longer seemed like hers. Photos of trips, smiles, holding hands, everything now belonged to the past of someone she was no longer. He deleted the images one by one. He cried like someone who understands, for the first time, that time cannot be reversed. And that not every regret finds a place to be fixed. That night, she wrote a letter. Not to him. To herself. Trying to understand when she'd lost so much. Trying to accept that the love she'd had was rare. And that rarities, once lost, rarely return. She didn't yet know what she would do with her life from then on. But she knew she would never forget what she'd lost. And even less so, what he had become without her. Because the real punishment wasn't loneliness. It was seeing with one's own eyes how much one can blossom when finally chosen by someone who also knows how to love. Weeks had passed since Isabella had witnessed with her own eyes what she had lost. The image of Daniel laughing beside Clara, that woman she had never considered a threat, became a constant presence in her mind. Not out of jealousy, that feeling had long since been overcome, but out of a painful awareness that the world had moved on, and she remained. The life that once seemed to orbit her now felt like an empty house, where all the voices had been silenced, where all the lights had been turned off, and only the echo of what she had neglected remained. With each attempt to fill the void, the lack of meaning in what had once entertained her became clearer. Sporadic friends, empty conversations, long, aimless nights. Everything was a shadow of something she herself had pushed away. She tried to start over. She looked for new classes, resumed exercising, redecorated parts of the house in the childish hope of feeling something different. But there was no disguising the truth. It wasn't about the environment, it was about her. She tried going out with other people, meeting new faces, allowing herself distractions. No connection went beyond the surface. No touch replaced what had been, no glance sustained a fond memory. Because what she missed wasn't just Daniel, it was the version of herself that existed when she was by his side. The woman who believed in love, who laughed without burden, who felt loved without fear. That woman was gone, and in her place remained only raw regret, a wound that opened every time silence filled the room where once there had been laughter, silly arguments, Sunday plans, and dreams whispered at the foot of the bed. One day, upon returning from the supermarket, she found a white envelope in the mailbox, addressed to her, in the handwriting she knew well. Her hands trembled. She hadn't expected anything more. She opened it on the stairs, leaning on the railing as if her legs weren't strong enough to support what was coming. The letter was brief. Daniel had written with simple frankness, as he always did. He said he was traveling for a few days and that, while tidying his bookshelf, he found a book she'd mentioned years ago, a Latin novel she swore he'd never understand. He concluded by saying, "I read it. And I understood. Thank you for introducing me to something that didn't resonate with me at the time, but which made me reflect today. Sometimes, the value of things is only realized when they're no longer available. I hope that one day you'll realize this too, and that you'll forgive yourself for what you didn't know how to experience at the right time." Isabella folded the paper slowly. She wept, but it was a silent, weary cry. That letter wasn't an invitation, it was a farewell. It was as if he'd left her the last piece of a puzzle she'd destroyed herself. Daniel, for his part, was in a different stage of his life. The aforementioned trip wasn't just a leisurely stroll. It was a process. He'd chosen a place far from his routine, where he could reframe his own steps. He spent days without a cell phone, walking unfamiliar streets, meeting people who knew nothing about his past. He discovered that there was still much within him to say, but that the need to be understood was no longer as urgent. Because now, more than anything, he understood himself. Clara accompanied him from a distance, respecting the space he needed. She didn't demand anything, didn't demand definitions. She simply existed beside him with a lightness he'd never experienced. And it was precisely this lack of pressure that made him want to stay. When he returned from the trip, he felt more whole. He returned with the desire to start something new, not as someone seeking a replacement, but as someone who understands that he can only offer love when he no longer carries the burdens of the past. It was a random Saturday when Daniel and Clara decided to take a walk in a park where he used to go with Isabella years ago. A place filled with memories. But that day, it felt like a new setting. While chatting about trivialities, they spotted an outdoor photography exhibition. Clara was drawn to one of the images, a child tenderly holding an injured bird. She said that image was the perfect expression of love, caring even when something seems irreparable. Daniel stared at it for long seconds. There, in that moment, he understood that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. And that, despite everything he had experienced, there was no resentment. There was learning. Isabella, in another part of town, received an unexpected visitor. Daniel's sister, with whom she had always had a cordial but distant relationship, showed up unannounced. They sat at the table with coffee in hand, and for the first time, they had a real conversation. His sister was direct. She said she wasn't there to fight, but to express her regret that everything had ended that way. She also said that Daniel never spoke ill of her, but that one day, shortly after the divorce, he had vented with a phrase she never forgot: "It's not the physical betrayal that hurts. It's knowing that for so long, you were alone in a relationship." Isabella swallowed hard. This wasn't news. It was just confirmation of what she herself felt, but had never had the courage to name. Hours later, walking the streets to try to dispel the weight of that conversation, Isabella decided to go into a bookstore she often visited. She picked up a copy of the same book Daniel mentioned in the letter. She read the first few pages like someone trying to reconnect with an old version of herself. She didn't find peace, but she did find reflections. And in one of the underlined passages of an old copy, it read, "Love does not die for lack of feeling, but for lack of care." She closed the book and realized it was time to face herself. She called the therapist she'd recommended to friends, but who'd always said she didn't need her. She scheduled the appointment. For the first time in a long time, she made a decision for herself, not to try to regain what she'd lost. In the office, she told her story without embellishment. She admitted mistakes, omissions, and poor choices. The therapist listened in silence and, at the end, said something that had been on her mind for days: "You didn't lose Daniel. You lost the woman he loved. Because she was there when you were doing well. Then she drifted away. And you didn't notice her leaving. Maybe because you were leaving too." Isabella left the office without an answer, but with a more honest pain. It was no longer about who was to blame. It was about the consequences of choices made in moments of emotional blindness. Months later, Daniel and Isabella's paths crossed again. At a charity event, both had been invited by different people. When they saw each other, there was a moment of silent tension, but then she smiled. A discreet smile, unintentional. He returned it. They talked like acquaintances who had once loved each other deeply. She talked about the courses she was taking, about therapy, about how she had moved apartments. He told her about the new project he was involved in and subtly mentioned Clara. Not as someone who was showing off, but as someone who recognized someone's importance in their own current story. Isabella listened calmly. When the farewell came, she extended her hand. He held it for a moment. There were no pretty words, no promises, no revisiting of the past. Just two human beings who, through different paths, had understood the value of the choices they had made. That night, when Daniel returned home, he found Clara on the porch, reading one of the books he'd brought from his trip. He sat down beside her, pulling out his chair slowly, as if each movement carried a purpose. She closed the book and said, looking into his eyes, "Are you well?" And he answered, without hesitation, "Now I am." Isabella, alone in her new apartment, made tea and sat by the window. She watched the street movement, the distant lights, and for the first time, she didn't cry. She picked up her phone and wrote a last message, one that would never be sent: "If one day I am remembered, may it not be for my mistake, but for the late effort to recognize the love I had." He deleted the message, smiled slightly and took a deep breath. Each one moved on. Not as before, nor as they dreamed. But as they should have. Because sometimes, forgiveness is the final step needed to close one chapter with respect. And move on to the next with dignity. The night of that reunion at the charity event brought no storms, no chaotic twists and turns, as fate might have planned long ago. It brought silence, maturity, and a kind of closure that doesn't depend on dramatic endings to be real. After saying goodbye, Daniel walked to his car with the steady steps of someone no longer burdened by old burdens. And when he arrived home, he found Clara asleep on the couch, the blanket half fallen and the living room light still on. He turned off the lamp, arranged the blanket over her, and sat there, simply watching. The calm of that scene permeated him so intensely that there was no more room for sorrow. For the first time in a long time, all Daniel felt was peace. And not the peace that comes from the absence of pain, but the one born of the profound understanding that he did all he could, that he was whole where many would be halves, that he loved without measure, and that he survived what nearly destroyed him. And now, with Clara, it wasn't about starting over from scratch, but rather about continuing from a point of maturity that only pain taught. Isabella, for her part, faced longer nights. There was no despair, no uncontrolled anguish, but there was an emptiness that became a constant companion. What weighed most heavily on her was no longer Daniel's absence, but the lack of meaning in the paths she followed after him. Everything she experienced after the end felt undeserved, as if she were living on loan, as if everything she touched had now belonged to someone more worthy. Friendships were reduced to the essential, and even the voices that once filled her days were now few and far between. She began to walk alone a lot, observing faces on the street, creating stories for strangers in the coffee line, trying to understand how much life was made of decisions that accumulate until they become destiny. She began to write, not to publish, but to recognize herself. In her texts, she created imaginary dialogues with the woman she once was. And in these dialogues, she tried to make peace with her flaws, not to justify what she did, but to avoid being completely destroyed by what she lost. Daniel allowed himself to open up a little more to Clara. He didn't talk much about the past because she didn't demand it. But little by little, he allowed her to see the scars, not as open wounds, but as parts of a story he never wanted to hide. One Sunday morning, while they were drinking coffee on the porch, she asked if he still felt anything. And he replied, with rare honesty, that he felt respect. Not for what they had been through, but for who he had become after everything happened. That it was in the pain of being left that he learned to choose himself. Clara simply nodded, as if understanding without judging. She also carried her traumas, her defeats, and perhaps that was why she didn't try to fill any space that wasn't offered. And that was precisely what made Daniel trust. Love, for him, was now synonymous with lightness, no longer with sacrifice. Over time, Isabella decided to change careers. Her old career no longer made sense. She wanted to dedicate herself to something that involved people, real stories, and encounters. She joined a social project as a volunteer, helping women in the process of emotional reconstruction. There, amid stories of violence, abandonment, and new beginnings, she found a way to heal herself. Because listening to other people's pain helped her see her own more clearly. She began to understand that, no matter how much the world had silently condemned her, she could still build a better version of herself. And it was during one of these meetings that she heard a phrase that would stay with her for a long time: there are pains that don't go away, but we learn to live with them without letting them define who we are. Since then, she began to see herself not as a victim of herself, but as responsible for everything she could still be. Daniel continued with Clara serenely. There was no rush to label her, but there was depth in every gesture. They began traveling together, rediscovering places he knew with new eyes, sharing silences that required no words. One afternoon, during a walk by a lake, he stopped and said he'd never felt so whole. Clara didn't respond immediately. She simply hugged him, and in that gesture there was more trust than any verbal response. It was confirmation that he had finally found a place of balance. A space where love wasn't a demand, nor dependency, but shared freedom. Meanwhile, Isabella reviewed old photos not with nostalgia, but with a searching eye. She kept some, tore others apart. She donated clothes that no longer meant anything, redesigned the apartment, and decided she would no longer carry memories as a burden. She wanted to remember what she had experienced, yes, but as a bridge, not a prison. She relearned how to take care of herself, how to cook just for herself, how to sleep without waiting for messages. And in the process, she rediscovered something valuable: the ability to forgive herself. Because even though she had made a mistake, even though she had hurt someone, she understood that the true punishment was having distanced herself from the woman she could have been, had she made different choices. One day, in a coffee shop, she saw a girl reading the same book Daniel had mentioned in his letter. On impulse, she approached and complimented her reading. They chatted briefly. The girl said the book had changed the way she viewed relationships. Isabella simply smiled, said she understood, and said goodbye. As she left, she realized she no longer felt the same weight on her chest. Perhaps because, for the first time, the past was no longer holding her back. It was simply teaching her, firmly, to look forward with greater awareness. Time passed as it does for everyone, with its routines, its unexpected events, and its twists and turns. Clara was introduced to Daniel's parents in a simple and warm meeting. There was a naturalness to the encounter, as if she had been part of the family for a long time. Daniel, observing everything, felt a kind of gratitude he had never experienced before. It wasn't just for her presence. It was for giving himself the chance to move on. For not having hardened himself from what he had experienced. For having allowed love to return, different, more mature. More whole. Isabella, in another reality, took a short trip alone. Nothing planned, nothing expensive. Just a getaway to find herself. She walked unfamiliar streets, sat on park benches, and jotted down random thoughts in an old notebook. In one of these reflections, she wrote, "The guilt doesn't go away. But one day, it stops screaming. And then, we hear our own voice again." He smiled as he reread it. For the first time in a long time, he felt proud of the path he was trying to build, even if it was a lonely one. They both continued on. And in this continuation, the moral dilemma that loomed over the story began to take shape. Because it wasn't just about betrayal, pain, and forgiveness. It was about a profound reflection on the real consequences of the choices we make, on the fragility of affection when unnurtured, and on how dear an emotional slip-up can be. Isabella wasn't just the woman who betrayed. She was the woman who betrayed herself first, by ignoring the value of what she had in the name of a freedom that, in truth, was an escape. And Daniel wasn't just the betrayed man. He was the man who had to rebuild himself in the face of the absence of the one who promised to stay, and who knew how to transform pain into maturity, without using revenge as currency. Now, there were no more villains. There were choices. And choices, once made, create realities that cannot be undone by regret. What remained for both of them, at that point in their lives, was to deal with these realities without pretense. To move forward, without repeating patterns. To acknowledge their own mistakes and successes without disguise. And above all, to understand that forgiveness, while liberating, is not the key to returning, it is the necessary final step for each person to find, in their own direction, a new meaning for love. It was spring when Daniel and Isabella's paths crossed once again, not by planned coincidence, but by one of those inevitable twists and turns life takes when it wants to quietly close a cycle. The city teemed with vibrant hues, the clear blue sky cut lightly across the landscape, but their meeting didn't happen at a social event, nor in a situation marked by chance. It was at a wake. The mother of an old mutual friend had passed away, and out of respect for the history they'd built together in the past, they both decided to attend. The pain of the moment wasn't theirs directly, but the atmosphere of the place made all the emotions that had been silent within each of them resurface like dry memories touched by the wind. She arrived first, sat in the middle row, her eyes downcast, hands clasped in her lap, and a restrained, almost absent expression. Daniel entered some time later, discreetly greeted the family, and, upon seeing Isabella, hesitated for a moment before sitting a few seats away. The ceremony was brief, but filled with meaning for everyone present. When it ended, Isabella remained seated, as if unsure whether to get up or prefer to let time pass slowly. Daniel stood, discreetly thanked the hosts, and, as he passed her, glanced at her. She looked up immediately, and for a second, they weren't ex-husband and ex-wife. They were just two familiar faces trying to recognize each other amidst the memory of so many other versions that had passed. He stepped forward, stopped beside her, and calmly said, "Would you like some coffee before you go?" She nodded wordlessly. They walked to a nearby cafe, one of those simple, uncrowded ones, and sat across from each other, as if returning to the origin of it all. There was a kind of peace in that gesture that asked for nothing more than presence. The waiter brought 2 coffees and a cheese bread she couldn't even remember if she liked any more. They sat in silence for a few minutes. Daniel was the first to speak. He didn't ask how she was, nor did he mention the past directly. He simply said, "It's strange how life puts us in places where we need to rediscover ourselves, even if we don't ask for it." Isabella took a deep breath, looked at him as if finally accepting her own vulnerability, and replied, "Maybe that's what I needed most. To rediscover myself. Even if I don't yet know what I'm seeing." He nodded, stirring his coffee slowly. There was no more hurt. There was no more desire. There was only respect for everything they had experienced and for everything they had finally left behind. She watched him curiously. He was no longer the same man. His gaze was more focused, more firm. And at the same time, lighter. Like someone carrying with him the freedom of someone who has overcome something immense, but hasn't let it turn him to stone. Isabella was in no rush to speak, but she felt the need to say something she'd never said out of pride. Not an excuse, nor an attempt to reclaim what had already died, but a human admission, something simple and direct with no intention of returning, just the truth. "I've never loved anyone the way I loved you," she said, her voice firm but her gaze moist. "But I lost my way, and when I tried to return, it was too late. Not for you. For me." Daniel wasn't moved, but something in him stirred. There was a quiet compassion in her response, "I believe that. But the truth is that love without care also kills. And when we realize it, there's no longer room to plant." She lowered her eyes, not as if ashamed, but as if acknowledging. That was it. What had been between them had been torn out by the roots, and even if memory still existed, the ground was no longer fertile. They left the coffee shop together and went their separate ways. But before turning the corner, Daniel turned and called her name, as if saying goodbye to someone who had marked the time. She looked back, waited for him to say something. He simply smiled and said, "It's going to be okay." And in that moment, she believed him. Because his tone held no resentment, only hope. A mature hope, of someone who no longer lives from what they've been through, but from what they can build from what they've learned. The next day, Clara and Daniel organized a simple dinner at home. They were hosting 2 couples of friends, and Clara, as always, took care of the details with care, but without exaggeration. Daniel, quieter than usual, was interrupted by her with a light touch on his back. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her eyes alert. He smiled, kissed her forehead, and replied, "Just thinking about how strange life can be, and generous, sometimes." She didn't ask any more questions. She knew he needed that inner space. She also knew there were stories that didn't need to be told anymore, just integrated. And there, as the house filled with voices, laughter, and the smell of food, Daniel knew he had finally rebuilt a home, not with the same pieces, but with new, more conscious, more solid choices. Isabella, on the other hand, spent the following days writing. She returned to an old, shelved project, a book of short stories about women starting over. She realized she'd never had the courage to give voice to her own pain, and that perhaps this was the time to transform the pieces into words. The nights no longer ached as before. There was still loneliness, but now it was filled with meaning. She no longer sought someone to complete her, but someone to accompany her without trying to erase her. In a chance encounter at a photography course, she met someone new. A simple man, unhurried, without exaggerated promises. He didn't dazzle her, but he listened attentively. And for the first time, she understood that this was exactly what she needed. One day, while organizing some old documents, Isabella found a letter she had never sent. It was for Daniel, written shortly after her divorce, but which she was afraid to deliver. She read every line as if it were from someone else. She realized how deeply she was overcome with guilt, how much she still hoped he would save her. She tore up the letter without pain. It was time to bury that version of herself, too. The woman who needed forgiveness to move on no longer existed. Now, there was another. One who, though scarred, no longer hid from herself. Daniel and Clara traveled the following weekend to a small town where no one knew them. They rented a simple cabin near a trail. On the second night, around the fireplace, she asked, "Do you think everything we've been through before, all the pain, was necessary for this?" He thought for a few seconds, looked into the fire, and replied, "I don't know if it was necessary. But it's what brought us here. And maybe some things we don't overcome. We transform." She came closer, laid her head on his shoulder, and in that gesture there were no promises, just presence. Isabella, in a new phase, no longer tried to erase the past. She kept a single photo of her and Daniel in a box, along with other memories. Not as an attempt to rescue something, but as a reminder that love, when lived truthfully, is never wasted time. Even if it ends. In a conversation with a friend, she said, "I loved wrong in the end. But I started loving right. And that beginning, was worth it." Her friend smiled and said this was a sign that she had finally understood. Their lives continued as lives do after storms. With new cycles, new names, new routines. But with the clear awareness that love only survives where there is loyalty, and that betrayal isn't just hurting the other, it's breaking with one's own identity. Daniel didn't become a bitter man. Isabella didn't become a broken woman. They both fell, rebuilt, and moved on. In different directions, yes, but with dignity. And in this silent movement of acceptance and new beginnings, there was more impact than any scandal. There was humanity. And perhaps, in the end, that's what most redeems the mistakes made along the way. It was on a Friday night that the cycle ended definitively, not with scandals or excessive tears, but with the kind of silence that arrives when the soul finally understands that what needed to be said has already been said, and what needed to be lived has already served its purpose. Daniel and Clara were returning from a simple dinner, the car radio playing an old song he recognized immediately, one he used to hear years ago, in another life, another time, another love. But that night, that song didn't hurt. It simply passed through him like a gentle memory, a sign that healed wounds don't need to be erased, just acknowledged. As they parked the car, Clara looked at him with a slight smile and said, "You're here, truly." And he, without hesitation, replied, for the first time, "Without half of me elsewhere." She held his hand tightly, and they drove home, where the future they were building no longer depended on ghosts from the past, only on the truth they upheld day after day. In the following months, their lives took on a more solid shape. Clara was promoted at work, and Daniel began giving lectures on emotional creativity and building bonds through communication. He didn't speak openly about his personal history, but his every speech was imbued with what he had experienced, what he had learned through pain. There was a calmness in his words that moved those who listened, and many saw themselves reflected in them, between pauses, short sentences, and glances that said more than he could verbalize. Clara accompanied him whenever she could, not as a shadow, but as support. And it was this silent, unpressured partnership that made Daniel believe that perhaps the most powerful love wasn't the one that sweeps you away, but the one that remains steadfast even after the storm, the one born from the constant and conscious choice to care. Meanwhile, Isabella was finishing the first manuscript of her book. It was a slow, painful, but necessary process. Each story she wrote brought pieces of women she knew and pieces of herself, mixed with the subtlety of someone who learned to transform pain into narrative. The independent publication had modest reach, but it brought back a kind of pride she hadn't felt in years. People began writing to her, telling their stories, thanking her for her sensitivity and for feeling understood through the pages. She discovered she could still make an impact, even carrying mistakes. And this made her rise with more courage each day. On a sunny Sunday, she participated in an event about emotional reconstruction and was invited to give a speech. She took the stage with a firm voice and said, "Not every open wound needs immediate healing. Some need listening, time, silence. And the courage not to repeat themselves." The people applauded sincerely. But the greatest applause came from within. For the first time, she felt at peace with the woman she had become. On a rainy late afternoon, the three of them found themselves in the same place once again. The launch of a collective book of chronicles where, coincidentally, Daniel wrote the foreword and Isabella was one of the authors. Clara stood proudly beside him. The reunion wasn't awkward. It was mature. They spoke briefly. Daniel praised her writing. Isabella thanked her for the sensitive foreword. Clara smiled and participated in the conversation with the same elegance she always had. And in that brief moment, three people who had already occupied such different roles in each other's lives were there, without hurt feelings, without rancor, only with the recognition that time puts everything in its rightful place, when we allow it. At the end of the event, they went their separate ways. And neither of them looked back. Years later, Daniel and Clara decided to marry discreetly, with only their closest friends and family. The ceremony was held in an open field surrounded by trees, where vows were exchanged with serenity and sincerity. Clara said, "I promise not to be everything, but to be whole." And he replied, "I promise not to wait for you to save me, but to walk with me, side by side." There was no exaggerated romanticism, there was reality, a desire to build, a desire to endure. It was the maturity that only those who have already rebuilt themselves can offer. Isabella continued her life with dignity. She didn't remarry, but not for lack of opportunities. She chose not to rush, not to fill voids with half-hearted presences. She had short relationships, but none that fulfilled her completely, and that was no longer a problem. She discovered that being alone didn't mean being empty. She went back to school, opened a small writing studio, and began teaching workshops for young women. She became a reference in her community and was often invited to share her journey. One day, a young woman asked her if she regretted what she had experienced. Isabella replied, "I regret what I destroyed without knowing what I was losing. But I'm grateful for what I became after facing it." The girl wrote down the answer with affection, but it was even more meaningful for Isabella herself. Because in that moment, she understood that the end she experienced wasn't the end of everything, it was the beginning of a life that could only be born after she stopped running from herself. And so, the story came to an end, not like in fairy tales, but like in real life. Where endings aren't always happy, but can be fair. Where love, when wounded, doesn't die immediately, but needs to be tended to every day to stay alive. Where betrayal not only destroys a relationship, but also the most honest version of the person who chooses to betray. Daniel rebuilt himself. Clara found someone who knew how to value her. Isabella learned to live with the consequences of her choices and found a new purpose. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Leave a comment, tell me your opinion, and share how this narrative touched you. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any stories like this. Always remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy love, it destroys bonds, dismantles families, and erodes what was built with care. It wounds deeply and often doesn't allow for reconstruction. Therefore, this channel does not support, normalize, or romanticize any type of betrayal. If you're here, it's because you understand that stories like this serve to open our eyes, to show that love requires respect, loyalty, and truth every day. Because love is an ongoing decision, and cheating is a mistake that often leaves no chance of undoing. Until the next story.